The corridor had no windows. It smelled of wet concrete and fear. 200 German women stood in a single file, pressed against the cold, tiled walls. They were silent. They had heard the rumors about showers in other camps, about gas that smelled like geraniums. But here, the air just smelled of mildew and stagnant water. Hanna stood in the middle of the line, her eyes fixed on the dirty neck of the woman in front of her. She was shivering, not just from the cold, but from the uncertainty. They were told to strip to their undergarments and wait. The waiting was always the worst part. At the head of the line sat the quartermaster. He was an older man, bored and indifferent. He sat behind a wooden crate filled with gray blocks. He didn't look at the women's faces. He didn't see them as people. To him, they were just hands reaching out. Thud, thud. The sound of the heavy blocks hitting palms echoed rhythmically in the narrow space. Take it. Move. Take it. Move. His voice was a drone, devoid of emotion. Hanna reached the front. She held out her hand. The quartermaster dropped a block into her palm. Her hand dipped under the weight. It was heavier than any soap she had ever held. Dense, cold, like a stone wrapped in fat. She stepped away quickly, pushed forward by the line behind her. She looked down at the object. It wasn't the white scented soap of her childhood. It was a mottled, sickly gray-brown color, rough and uneven. It looked like hardened clay dug from a riverbed. It feels greasy, the woman next to her whispered. Greta was rubbing her thumb against the block. And it doesn't smell. Hanna brought the block to her nose. Greta was right. It had no perfume, no chemical scent, just a faint, cloying odor of raw fat and something else, something metallic. It left a strange, waxy film on her skin just from holding it. A shiver ran down Hanna's spine that had nothing to do with the cold. Move inside. Tend to a trough. The guards herded them. The metal doors clanged open, revealing a cavernous room filled with the hiss of pipes. It wasn't a room designed for comfort. It was designed for efficiency. Rows of long, rusted zinc troughs ran the length of the floor. Above them, perforated pipes dripped icy water. Hanna was shoved forward by the press of bodies. She stumbled towards a basin, the gray block of soap clutched tight in her hand. The air here was thick with moisture, but it wasn't the clean steam of a bathhouse. It was a damp, metallic fog that tasted of rust and unwashed bodies. Hanna plunged her hands under the freezing stream. The water hit her skin like needles, numbing her fingers instantly. She brought the gray block under the flow, trying to work up a lather. Normal soap would become slick, producing white bubbles, but this behaved like mud. As the water hit it, the surface turned into a brownish, viscous slime. It didn't slide over her skin. It dragged. It felt gritty, like rubbing wet sand and grease against her body. It won't foam. A woman next to her cried out in frustration. It just melts. Then, Hanna felt the scratch. She was scrubbing her arm when she felt something sharp snag against her skin. It wasn't a large cut, just a pinch, like a bug bite or a thorn. She pulled the soap away. Embedded in the softening gray sludge was a dark line. At first she thought it was a crack in the soap, or perhaps a twig caught in the manufacturing process. She tried to wipe it away with her thumb. It moved, but it didn't come off. It was rooted deep inside the block. She pinched the end of it and pulled. The object resisted. It had elasticity. Hanna pulled harder, her heart skipping a beat as the thing uncoiled from the melting grease. It came out slowly, sliding wetly through the soap. 1 inch, 2 inches, 3 inches. It was a long, thin strand. It curled around her finger, dark and fine. Hanna stared at it, her brain refusing to process what she was seeing. It wasn't a fiber from a uniform. It wasn't Greta, Hanna whispered, her voice trembling. She held up her hand. the long black strand dangling from her finger like a dead worm. Look. Greta stopped scrubbing. She looked at the hair. Then she looked at her own block of soap. She dug her nail into the surface, scraping away the top layer. There, just beneath the gray film, was a tangle of something golden. Not one strand, but a mesh of them. Matted, clumped, like the contents of a hairbox mixed into clay. The realization hit them like a physical blow. Hanna dropped the soap into the metal trough. It landed with a heavy splat. The water swirling around it wasn't soapy white foam. It was oily and murky. She looked at her own body. She had been rubbing this substance onto her skin. She felt a wave of nausea, so violent. She had to grip the edge of the basin to keep from falling. This wasn't soap made from chemicals. It was soap made from people. It's hair. It's human hair. The scream tore through the steam. Hanna couldn't keep it inside. The horror was too big. The cry echoed off the tiled walls, silencing the hiss of the pipes. Heads turned. Women who were mid-wash froze, their hands covered in the brownish slime. "Look at it," Hanna shouted, pointing to the sink where the gray sludge was dissolving to reveal the tangled black knot. The woman next to her looked at her own hands, then at the block she was holding. She screamed and threw it against the wall. It hit with a wet thud, leaving a greasy smear on the white tile. Panic spread like a contagion. It moved down the line faster than fire. One by one, women inspected their soap. One found a tooth fragment. Another found a piece of bone chip. Most just found the hair, matted, chopped strands, embedded in the fat. The sound of heavy soap blocks hitting the concrete floor erupted like a hailstorm. Clatter, splash, thud. Within seconds, the floor was littered with the gray lumps. The women backed away from the troughs as if the sinks were filled with acid. But the soap was already on them. That was the true horror. They had already lathered it onto their arms, their chests, their faces. The greasy film was clinging to their skin. Hanna looked at her arms. The brownish slime felt heavy, suffocating. It wasn't just dirt. It was biomatter. It was the remains of others. She felt like she was coated in the dead. "Get it off!" Someone shrieked. "Get it off me!" They began to scrub, but not with soap. They used their fingernails. They used the rough wool of their discarded uniforms. They used the rusted edges of the water troughs. Hanna clawed at her own arm, scratching until red welts appeared. Then blood. She wanted to peel off her skin. The water from the overhead pipes was freezing, but it wasn't enough to wash away the psychological stain. No amount of water could cleanse this. They were trying to wash a ghost off their bodies. "What is going on in here?" The doors banged open. 3 guards stormed in, batons drawn. They slipped on the soapy, slime-covered floor. "Order!" the sergeant shouted. "Stand at attention." But the order was lost. The women were hysterical. They weren't rebelling against the guards. They were rebelling against their own skin. One woman ran towards the sergeant, hands held out, covered in the brown sludge. "It's people," she screamed in German. "You are making us wash with people." The sergeant looked at the floor. He saw the scattered gray blocks dissolving in the puddles. He saw the hair, long golden strands floating in the dirty runoff water like seaweed. He stopped. The smell hit him. Then, the smell of the rendering plant, distinct and undeniable. He looked at the soap on his own boot. His face went pale. He raised his baton not to strike, but to push the woman away. Even he didn't want to touch them now. The pipes groaned, and the water died. The guards cut the main valve. The freezing spray turned into a trickle, then stopped. Silence fell over the shower room, broken only by the sound of shivering wet bodies. "Out! Everyone out!" the sergeant ordered, his voice lacking its usual authority. He wanted them gone. He wanted to hose down the floor and wash the evidence into the drains. Hanna stood there, dripping wet, the brownish slime still clinging to her arms. She hadn't rinsed it off. Now it was drying on her skin. The march back to the barracks was a funeral procession. The cold evening air hit their damp skin, turning the oily film into a waxy crust. It felt like a second skin, a dead skin, shrinking around them. No one spoke. The usual chatter about food or home was gone. They walked with their arms held away from their bodies, trying not to touch themselves, trying not to spread the contamination. But it was already everywhere. In their pores, in their hair, in their mind. The barracks smelled of it. Usually the room smelled of stale sweat, mold, and unwashed wool. But tonight, as 200 women crowded in, a new scent filled the air. It was faint but undeniable, the sickly sweet copper tang smell of the rendering plant. It came from them. Hanna sat on her bunk, staring at her hands. She scratched her wrist. White flakes of dried soap fell off, but the smell remained. She felt like she was glowing with invisible rot. Then the scratching started. It began in the corner with one woman, scritch, scritch, scritch. Then another joined in. Then another. It wasn't lice. It wasn't a rash. It was psychological repulsion. The thought of the human fat and the hair on their skin made them itch uncontrollably. Within minutes, the sound filled the dark room. The dry, frantic sound of hundreds of fingernails scraping against skin. It was the sound of a hive going mad. Where did it come from? A voice whispered in the dark. The lights were out, but no one was sleeping. The camp next door, Greta whispered back from the bunk above. They say the chimneys smoke all day, but they never cook food. Hanna squeezed her eyes shut. She didn't want to hear it. She knew the camp next door. She had seen the trains arrive full and leave empty. They are recycling them, the voice trembled. They are recycling us. Hanna tried to sleep, but the hair was there. Every time she drifted off, she felt it. A phantom sensation. A long, thin strand of hair wrapping around her throat, wrapping around her fingers. She gagged and sat up, clawing at her neck. There was nothing there, just her own sweat and the lingering grease. She looked at her hands in the moonlight. They looked clean, but she knew she would never, ever be clean again. Morning roll call was merciless. The harsh gray light of dawn revealed what the darkness had hidden. 200 women stood at attention in the freezing courtyard. They looked like victims of a plague. Their necks, arms, and faces were covered in angry red scratches and scabs from a night of frantic clawing. They were a formation of the flayed. Hanna stood rigidly, the collar of her tunic chafing against the raw skin of her neck. She stared straight ahead, trying to ignore the burning itch that still crawled over her body. The commander walked down the line. He didn't look at their wounds. He stopped in the center of the yard. There was hysteria in the showers last night, he announced, his voice clipping through the cold air. Rumors spread by weak minds. We do not waste supplies here. Anyone caught repeating these lies about the soap will receive 10 lashes and solitary confinement. Forget it. Happened. It was an order to unsee the dead. Back in the barracks, the silence was heavy. No one dared to speak about the soap. The threat of the lash hung over them. Hanna sat on her bunk, feeling hunger gnaw at her stomach. She reached into the deep pocket of her wool tunic, hoping to find a forgotten crumb of bread from yesterday's ration. Her fingers brushed against something. It wasn't bread. It was waxy, small, and irregular. She pulled it out into the daylight. It was a piece of the gray soap, no bigger than a fingernail. It must have broken off during the panic in the shower and stuck to her wet uniform. Hanna stared at it. In the harsh light, it looked even more repulsive. A mottled clump of rendered fat and gray ash. She should have thrown it away immediately. It was dangerous contraband now. but she couldn't stop looking at it. She saw the speck on the edge. Hanna brought the crumb closer to her eyes. Sticking out of the waxy gray mass was a tiny, almost invisible detail. The cut end of a golden hair, just the tip, sharp where it had been chopped. It was undeniable proof. It wasn't a hallucination born of fear. It was real. She was holding a piece of another human being in her palm. The door swung open. A guard stepped in. Hanna's heart slammed against her ribs. Her hand instinctively closed tight into a fist, hiding the crumb. The guard looked around the room suspiciously. His eyes lingering on Hanna, she stopped breathing. If he searched her, if he opened her hand, she would be beaten. Maybe killed. She realized with horror that the soap wasn't just on her skin anymore. Now she had to carry it. A toxic secret, warm inside her clenched fist. 3 days passed in suffocating silence. Nobody spoke about the showers. The commander's threat hung over the barracks like a shroud, but the silence was louder than screams. They all knew they couldn't look each other in the eye. To look was to see the guilt reflected back. The scratching never stopped. It became the background noise of their existence. A dry, rasping chorus of 200 women, trying to peel off their own skin in the dark. Hanna still held the crumb. For 3 days, she had kept her left hand clenched in a tight fist. The tiny piece of gray soap had softened from her body heat, turning into a greasy smudge against her palm. She wanted to drop it through a crack in the floorboards, to be rid of it, but she couldn't let go. It felt like abandoning a body. It was a piece of evidence, a piece of a person, and she was trapped with it. Inspection. Everyone up. The doors crashed open before dawn. Guards swarmed in, turning over cots, emptying kit bags onto the floor. It was a surprise search for contraband. Panic seized Hanna. They were patting down prisoners. If they opened her hand, if they found the gray smear with the golden hair, she would be taken to the bunkers. She would never return. The guard was 2 bunks away. She had seconds to decide. She couldn't drop it. She couldn't eat it. In a spasm of pure terror, Hanna made a choice that turned her stomach. She pressed her left thumb hard against the tip of her index finger. She jammed the soft, greasy gray crumb deep underneath her own thumbnail. It hurt. The pressure was immense, separating the nail from the quick. She pushed until the gray matter disappeared completely. Under the keratin shield, the guard stopped in front of her. Hands out, palms up. Hanna obeyed. Her hands were shaking uncontrollably. The guard glanced at her dirty palms. They were empty. He grunted and moved to the next woman. Hanna let out a breath she didn't know she was holding. She was safe. The secret was hidden. The guards left. The silence returned. Hanna sat back on her bunk. The adrenaline faded, replaced by a deep, sickening horror. She looked at her left hand. Underneath the thumbnail, there was a thin, dark gray line, framed by inflamed red skin. It wasn't just on her anymore. It was in her. A piece of the dead was now part of her own body. She began to scratch her arm again, harder this time, knowing she would never be clean.